If you had told me a few years ago that one of the most underrated cities in America was hiding right in the middle of the country, I honestly wouldn't have believed you. Because before moving to St. Louis, I thought I already knew what this city was all about. Most people hear St. Louis and immediately think about the crime statistics, baseball, maybe the arch, and that's pretty much it. But the second you actually move here, you realize there's a completely different side to this place that almost nobody talks about online. And honestly, some of the biggest surprises weren't even the things I expected. It was the fact that houses were dramatically cheaper than cities I'd lived in before. It was how wildly different every neighborhood felt from the next. It was realizing locals are fiercely loyal to the city, even while constantly joking about themselves. And it was discovering that your experience in St. Louis can completely change depending on what part of the area you choose to live in. There were also a few things that caught me totally off guard, like the weather mood swings, the strange highway setups, and how serious people here are about food. So if you're thinking about moving to St. Louis, relocating somewhere more affordable, or you're just curious what living here is actually like day to day, this video will probably save you from a few surprises I wish someone had warned me about earlier. And if you enjoy honest relocation content that goes beyond the usual surface level advice, make sure to like the video and subscribe because I'll be sharing a lot more about living in and around St. Louis. One of the first things that generally shocked me after moving to St. Louis was how far your money actually goes here. And I know people say that a lot about Midwest cities, but St. Louis feels different because you're not sacrificing as much as you'd expect. If you're coming from places like Chicago, Denver, Austin, or especially somewhere like Los Angeles, the housing prices almost don't feel real at first. You start seeing full brick homes, decent sized yards, historic neighborhoods, and apartments with actual space for prices that would barely get you into a tiny studio in some bigger cities. And the weird part is that it changes your mindset fast. People here aren't spending every waking second trying to survive financially. There's a little more breathing room. You notice people going out more, buying homes younger, and generally looking less financially stressed than in a lot of major metro areas. Now, that doesn't mean everything is dirt cheap. Utilities can hit harder than people expect during the summer and winter because the weather here gets intense. Property taxes can vary a lot depending on where you live. And if you move without researching neighborhoods first, you can still overpay pretty easily. But overall, the affordability was probably the single biggest reason St. Louis felt livable so quickly. Instead of constantly feeling behind financially, it finally felt possible to actually build a life here instead of just keeping up with bills. One thing I seriously underestimated before moving to St. Louis was how dramatically the neighborhoods are different from each other. And I'm not talking about small differences. I mean, completely different lifestyles, completely different energy, and honestly, completely different experiences living in the same metro area. This is probably the biggest mistake newcomers make. They hear St. Louis as one giant category, when in reality, where you choose to live will shape almost everything about your day to day life. You've got areas that feel super urban and walkable, places with beautiful historic architecture, quiet suburban neighborhoods with top rated schools, trendy younger areas full of restaurants and nightlife, then pockets that feel completely disconnected from all of that just a few minutes away. And then there's the city versus county confusion that catches almost everybody off guard at first. Locals talk about the city and the county like they're two different worlds. If you're not from here, it can honestly take a while to understand how everything is divided and why people care about it so much. What surprised me most is how strongly people identify with their specific area. Someone from one neighborhood may have a totally different opinion of St. Louis than someone living 15 minutes away. That's why researching neighborhoods here is absolutely critical before moving. Because if you accidentally pick an area that doesn't match your lifestyle, commute, or expectations, it can completely change how you feel about the city overall. But if you find the right fit, St. Louis starts making a lot more sense. Suddenly you understand why so many people who move here end up staying way longer than they actually planned. Nobody prepared me for how chaotic the weather feels in St. Louis. And locals will joke about this constantly because it's honestly one of the most accurate stereotypes about living here. You can wake up freezing in the morning, need a hoodie by lunch, and then somehow be sweating by dinner. The weather changes fast, and when people say you experience all four seasons here, they are not exaggerating. The humidity was probably the biggest adjustment for me. Summer doesn't just feel hot, it feels heavy. You walk outside for 5 minutes and immediately understand why everybody talks about humidity season like it's an annual survival challenge. Then winter shows up and suddenly you're scraping ice off your windshield while questioning every life decision that brought you here. Storm season is another thing newcomers notice quickly. People here are very aware of severe weather and tornado warnings, but what's funny is how calm locals seem about it. Meanwhile, if you're new to the area, hearing sirens for the first time can feel slightly terrifying. The weird thing is, after a while, you almost start appreciating the unpredictability. The changing seasons give the city personality. Fall is beautiful, spring can be amazing, and even though the weather keeps you guessing, it stops life from feeling repetitive. You just learn very quickly to never trust the forecast completely. Compared to a lot of major cities, traffic in St. Louis honestly feels pretty manageable. And that was one of the first quality of life upgrades I noticed after moving here. People complain about traffic locally, but if you've lived somewhere with hour-and-a-half commutes or nonstop gridlock, St. Louis traffic barely feels like a real problem most days. You can usually get across the metro area surprisingly fast, and parking is dramatically easier than in bigger cities. But the adjustment comes from the driving culture itself. For some reason, highways here seem designed to keep you slightly stressed at all times. Lanes randomly disappear, exits show up with almost no warning, and if you miss one turn, suddenly your GPS adds another 15 minutes to your trip. And then there's the local driving style. People drive fast here, not aggressive in the big city road rage kind of way, just confidently fast. So when you're new, there's definitely a learning curve to where you're trying to figure out which exits matter while someone flies past you doing 20 over the speed limit. The funny thing is, once you understand the highway system, getting around becomes incredibly convenient. And after living here for a while, you start realizing how spoiled you become when you visit cities with genuinely terrible traffic. This was probably one of the most unexpected surprises about living in St. Louis. The food scene here is seriously underrated. Before moving here, I honestly had no idea how much local pride revolves around food. And once you start exploring different neighborhoods, you realize every area has its own personality, its own favorite spots, and its own debates about what restaurants are actually the best. Of course, everybody talks about the barbecue and the Italian influence, especially around areas like the Hill. But what surprised me more was how many genuinely great local restaurants exist out of the places tourists usually hear about. You'll find amazing brunch spots, family-owned restaurants that have been around forever, hidden burger places, incredible international food, and random neighborhood spots that locals defend like family traditions. And unlike some cities where going out to eat constantly feels financially painful, St. Louis still gives you room to actually enjoy the restaurant scene regularly. That changes the social culture a lot. People here meet over food constantly. Weekend brunches are a big thing. Local spots become part of people's routines and identities. The funny part is that newcomers often underestimate St. Louis entirely until they start eating their way through the city. Then suddenly they understand why locals get oddly passionate about recommending restaurants. And once people start giving you very serious opinions about pizza styles here, that's when you know you've officially become part of the city. Before moving to St. Louis, almost every conversation I had about the city sounded the same. Isn't it dangerous? And honestly, that reputation scared me at first a little bit too. Because if you search St. Louis online, a lot of what you'll see focuses almost entirely on crime statistics and negative headlines. So before you even arrive, it's easy to build this picture in your mind that the entire city feels unsafe all the time. But once you actually live here, you realize that the reality is far more complicated than the internet makes it seem. Now, obviously, like any major metro area, there are places you should research carefully in areas that experience real challenges. Nobody should move anywhere blindly. But what surprised me was how different the lived experience felt compared to the national perception. Most daily life here feels normal. People are working, raising families, walking dogs, going to restaurants, hanging out in parks, and building communities just like anywhere else. And one thing you notice quickly is how defensive locals become when outsiders talk negatively about St. Louis. At first, I didn't fully understand it, but after living here for a while, I kind of get it now. Because the city has layers most people never see unless they spend real time here. There's history, culture, beautiful architecture, strong communities, and a level of local pride that's pretty much contagious. St. Louis definitely is not perfect. Locals will be the first people to tell you that, but the city's reputation online feels incomplete compared to the actual experience of living here day to day. And honestly, that disconnect might be one of the biggest surprises of all. One thing I really didn't expect after moving to St. Louis was how genuinely friendly people are here, and not in the forced customer service kind of way. I mean, people actually take time to talk to you. Neighbors introduce themselves, strangers start conversations in grocery stores. Remember, people remember your name at local coffee shops. There's a slower, more personal energy that can feel surprisingly refreshing if you're coming from a faster paced city. At first, it almost caught me off guard. In a lot of larger cities, people tend to stay in their own bubble because everybody's busy, stressed, or constantly rushing somewhere. But in St. Louis, there's more of a community feeling than I expected. People seem more connected to their neighborhoods, local businesses, schools, and traditions. And honestly, that changes your quality of life more than you realize. Over time, the city starts feeling smaller in a good way. You begin recognizing familiar faces, discovering favorite spots, and building routines that actually feel personal instead of transactional. I also noticed that people here tend to be very real with you. Midwestern honesty is definitely a thing. Locals will absolutely tell you their opinions, but there's usually warmth behind it. And I think that's part of why so many transplants end up staying here longer than they planned. The affordability gets people to consider St. Louis, but the relationships and sense of community are often what make people feel at home. So overall, moving to St. Louis ended up surprising me in ways I never expected. It's not a perfect city. The weather can be chaotic. The neighborhoods take time to understand, and the city definitely has its challenges. But underneath all of that, there's a level of affordability, personality, history, food culture, and community that a lot of people completely overlook. Honestly, that's why I think so many people move here planning for it to be temporary, then end up staying for years. If you're thinking about relocating to St. Louis, hopefully this gave you a more realistic picture of what living here actually feels like beyond the headlines and the stereotypes. And if you already live here, let me know what you think in the comments. What surprised you the most about St. Louis? Or what do you wish you knew before moving here? If you enjoyed this video and want more honest content about living, moving, and relocating around St. Louis, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.